So, Castoriadis, after Castoriadis, Rhasidus. It's you.
It's me. Now, he's very generous, as you understand, Peter, because he organized the whole thing today together with Tim here, and we're very lucky that we have a person with his organizational skills, his inspirational skills as well, and you see his elegance and grace, which was very important, the way that he immediately makes you feel at home, and he says that this is something important you're going to hear, and something good that you're going to hear, and despite that, you understand, you will be disappointed. I know all of you, because in these public lectures you have to be somewhere in the middle. The philosophers want more philosophy, and the wider public wants more, just popularized things. So I'll try to combine those two, and I'll make it more difficult for both of them, as you understand in this case. In this case, you have simply to have to disappoint all your friends, as you understand, right? And remember, as I said, as we were saying before, we organized this meeting for the last 11 years, and Peter has been always in there, and my colleague Greg from Sydney University, and Peter Murphy. Where is Peter Murphy? I can't see him more. Oh, glasses. Yes, yeah, right, this. And Susie Adams, who is not here with us. We have been a committee of, of people who have nothing else to do but to deal with this peripheral, just very minor figure who actually, unfortunately, I believe that becomes more and more well-known, but more studied. And I think after the storm and the drunken storm of the French structuralism, post-structuralism has passed, gradually is dying out. Castoriadis becomes much more sort of like a dominant, and I think in the future, most of his works will be translated into English, from French or Greek. But very interesting. We will form a complete perception of his work and what he tried to do with his philosophical projects over the years, as you know, for almost six decades. I know that some young people came here today, know nothing about Castoriadis. I'll give you a very brief biographical thing, and then I'll go to my topic, because for some of you who, my question, some of you who are watching the news, you remember what happened at Sydney University with the establishment of the Ramsey Center, that we have the Western civilization, which has become a question if there is such a thing as Western civilization, and if Westerners are all bad, evil, and evil colonialists who want to exterminate people and destroy their cultures and appropriate them, or there's actually like every culture, we're bad and good and we're this and that, and who knows what else we might be in the future. Castoriadis has very heretical ideas, unorthodox, heterodox ideas, I would say, in this case, and I think that it's time we discuss about them, and we've tried to find some answers, at least guided by him. Whatever I'm going to say here today doesn't mean that they accept all his interpretations, or you accept all his interpretations. We're beyond the, as you understand, the philosopher is not a prophet, is not a religious figure, not to take him seriously as at that level, but critically engaged with an idea, with a statement, and trying to use it in order to explain, understand, and finally, I would say, act upon your ideas, upon this idea. So, without further ado, for the people who know nothing about Castoriadis, although you are in Colombia, you said, eh?
Yes.
He's a cult figure in Colombia, Castoriadis. And I was at a conference a few years ago in Brazil, and there were all these Colombian thinkers who knew more about Castoriadis than I did, and I felt so embarrassed. What are they doing, all these people are there? Probably because of his connection with Francesco Varela, I think, the Chilean philosopher, and all these sort of kind of things that he was, his philosophy was even adopted by, what do we call this group in Mexico, fighting against the government? The Zapatistas. Actually, I met a leader of the Zapatistas in Paris who was explaining to me a militant, with a gun in him. He was talking to us about the autopoiesis in Castoriadis. This is what the Zapatistas are doing. What do you think? Yeah.
Yeah, they have their own interpretation of things.
You have your own interpretation. You should have been here. You know, last year you gave us a very beautiful paper on this, and we missed you this year.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to get something done.
Oh, and I lost your.
That's why I haven't mentioned.
So, who was Castoriadis? In order to give you a very brief 5-line actual introduction. Him. He was born in Constantinople in 1922. He left after he was expelled. Actually, his family, something that Tim didn't mention because he's as like a good Australian, don't like attention to divisive issues. Castoriadis was a refugee, and he never gone beyond that. As you understand, this idea that he was uprooted from his home in Constantinople was very, very important to him, and later on impacted him, if I may, psychologically, because of the life of his father, and especially the life of his mother as well, who actually became rather insane because when she lost, they became refugees and lost everything. So there is this deracination, I think, that in him, which goes back to his original years. You know, he was only 6 or 8 months old when they had to go. They had to leave everything behind, and he has a very touching description in a Greek text about what happened when he left his home and he went back to Athens. They didn't know anyone in Athens. In Athens, they were what they called them the Turkish foreigners, as they called them. So nobody talked to them. So they had to rebuild themselves from scratch. So he maintained this, I think, always externality and a bit of sort of kind of marginality within the Greek society and the Greek philosophical movement, as well as later on when he escaped to France. And something that we have to mention now, he escaped to France because the Communist Party was trying to kill him, as you remember, right? You know, the Communist Party was, after 1944, decided that they had to get rid of the undesirables or the deplorables of that period, and they started killing all these most important intellectuals of Greece. And most of them found sort of escape with a strange scholarship program of scholarships given by the French government. And essentially a whole generation of the most important Greek intellectuals, Papaioannou, Xenakis, Kranaki, all of them left and went to Paris, and most of them wrote in French. So that's why, as you see, the Greeks love him, because he wrote everything in French. Because his Greek texts are unreadable.
His French ones too.
Yeah. Well, I try to translate into English his early texts, and they are incomprehensible in English as they are incomprehensible in Greek. And as a translator, you have the dilemma. What do? You translate? Do you make meaning? Do you produce meaning out of this, or you leave it as it is? So, question, I'm not answering. So, well, after he went through Marxism, as you understand, he went all through this trajectory, then he rejected Marxism because, or not simply with intellectual issues, but also because of what happened in 1956, and then the Soviet state capitalism, as he called it, and later on, as you see, he started psychoanalysis, and he became one of the most important intellectuals through journals like Socialism and Barbarie that we study today, and later on, he created his own sort of, if I may say, point of view, philosophical worldview, which became dominant after the 70s, early 80s, when it was obvious that communism, his critique of existing communism was essentially becoming true, essentially, and the whole system would collapse eventually. And Castoriadis always thought I met him once, as I said, in Athens, and he said, I will repeat what Go Vidal said, the sweetest words in any language were, I told you so. So, I mean, this is a very interesting, as you understand, trajectory, and shows something you talked about, that his sense of humor as well, because he was a very humorous individual. His prose lacks heavy reads like a very heavy, as we call it, rhetorical or rhetorical text, but as an individual, he was really, really sort of the kind where he had a very raucous sense of humor and almost, as an Athenian perspective, a sense of saying bad jokes. As the Greeks, we don't have a sense of humor. So, for them, in the 80s and before his death in 1996, in the 90s, Castoriadis embarked after his critique, I said, of Marxism and the other philosophical currents of the period, tried to revisit the love of his youth, which was classical Greece, and when not simply the political system, which always preoccupied his thought and in Athenian democracy, but the philosophical, essentially, legitimization of the ancient tradition, especially of the ancient democracy. He gave a series of lectures in Paris called, which were published later on under the title Qui Fait la Grèce, what makes Greece, what creates Greece, what Greece created, and at the same time was being translated in Greek is not being translated in English yet, the Greek particularity, which is, I think, a very apt translation of the whole thing. So why this fascination with classical Greece? And why do we study him today under the conditions that I said that we have today in Australia? I'll go back to my paper last year and the year before, which was here as a prop on Sappho. Castoriadis' readings are very strange because it starts with a very interesting reading of Plato, of Homer, and his Iliad and Odyssey. We saw the program today where he talked about them, but there he analyzes specifically what happens in the Iliad. We think it's the most absurd Kafkaesque poem ever written because the Greeks are fighting to conquer a city which they know they're not going to conquer as long as the best amongst them is still alive. And it's a very strange poem in this case, as you understand. Plus, for some of you who read the Iliad cautiously and carefully, you will understand that if you don't know Greek mythology, you don't know what happens at the end. Did the Greeks conquer the city? No. Nobody knows. If you don't know the history about the whole thing, on the contrary, the Iliad ends with everybody crying about the father Priam cries about his son, and Achilles cries about his friend, and there's no resolution to the whole story. There will be, essentially the reconciliation between them happens through an act of mourning and grief. And there's no solution to this incredible problem that we have there, the conflict between these two historical entities. And Castoriadis thinks that this is one of the most important elements that we see, something that we said that we find in Arendt, that Castoriadis never takes a side in the whole thing. This indeed what Hannah Arendt calls the divine impartiality of Homer. Castoriadis works on this, and essentially you see that Castoriadis praises the enemy more than he praises the Greeks. Because only a very praiseworthy enemy can be defeated by someone who is better than she. But you must never praise that who actually defeats the great warrior, because that becomes arrogance. So that you see all these incredible elements that we see. But Castoriadis goes on with reading of Hesiod as well, early archaic poetry, and then finally, actually it's obvious with the 5th century, the moment of tragedy and the development of tragedy in Athens. And of course, Castoriadis also reads probably the most philosophical historiographer of the period, who was Thucydides. He loves Herodotus, but Thucydides is his special love affair in this case. So I will start with this reading of Thucydides, and then I'll go back to see how actually through his reading he tried to address an issue which was dominant in the 80s and probably in the 90s, which he called the dilapidation of the West. How the West itself started dilapidating, destroying, deconstructing its own sort of if I may say, worldview, its own philosophical tradition, its own philosophical trajectory and adventure, as he called it, for reasons that we discussed this morning, and there are still questions unanswerable. Paul Valéry called classical Athens the sweetest dream of European modernity. And this dream seems to have consumed, especially French intellectual life since the early days of the Enlightenment, when Athens became the locus of a grand philosophical theater, and a new entity was born, a new conceptualization for all philosophical enterprise to this day, a paradise lost, under the name of the so-called the Greeks. The Greeks have a glorious pedigree to reflections by philosophers, but also created the idea of a paradise lost, almost a utopian place for philosophers and their thinking. Even Karl Marx had later to deal with the questions of the Greeks, as he said. We gave unsurpassed, as he stressed as well, models to us today, and they were the natural, as he called them, children of history. Marx tried to answer the question of the seduction that the Greeks have to our longing for to this day, that the Greeks have been until the 19th century period, because he says now we have outgrown them, but yet we are still moved by what they did. And he said that he came to the conclusion that we have a longing for our childhood, since social progress meant also philosophical and aesthetic progress. Have we produced better works, he says, than the Greeks? No. Why do we admire them? Because they remind us of our childhood. Despite the reservations that we raised by Marx's position, the question of the Greeks remained strong in the age of European modernity, weakened slightly during the postmodernity period, but now it came up again, and now I think comes back with a vengeance, despite some ideas by Kwame Appiah that there is no such a thing as Western civilization, in an article that he published in The Guardian a few years ago. For some of you who read the article in The Guardian, you will see the simply writes of how Western ideas were disseminated by other cultures or through other cultures. He doesn't say that they were, despite the title of the article itself. Together with the philosophes of the 18th century, the Greeks were adopted by the German Romanticism in a strange fusion with their medieval fantasies. Ever since, every philosopher, not to say every philosophical generation, has to confront the great texts of the Greeks. Since Heidegger's translation of the choral song from Antigone, and its constant reconsideration by Hegel, Heidegger, Gadamer, Lacan, and so many others, the philosophical discussion of the philosophical horizon of our discussions has been defined by that constant reference to the Greeks. My paper today, therefore, in this form, is a rather preliminary discussion of how Castoriadis approached the Greeks, and especially in this case Thucydides. I would like to point out not only the vitality of that tradition, but also would like to engage critically with Castoriadis himself, since recently there is a publishing industry around his work, which ends up with a cult, then transforming him into a cult, and moreover as the plaything of a coterie made by philosophical dilettantes, according to my perception, especially in Greece that happens, because as you understand, in Greece every discussion about the ancient Greeks has nationalistic resonances, and becomes really the Greeks lose the philosophical content and they become national emblems or markers of national superiority. And if you ask modern Greeks if they have read Plato, no, of course. If they've read Aristotle, what is that? And they know of Aristotle Onassis, but Aristotle, but who was Plato? Aristotle in this case. Castoriadis himself was not afraid to be critical, I believe, of his own ideas, and somehow indicates a change of mind that took place as contextual realities changed as well. He was not also afraid to deal with the great philosophical question raised by the Greeks. In a series of lectures, as I said, between 1984 and 1986, he tried to reimagine, as he said, what he called what made Greece, what created Greece, and attempted the systematic reading of central texts of the pre-Socratics, the poets, and finally, and poets and thinkers, as well as philosophers. As I said before, we discussed the approach of Sappho and the lyric poetry, which is something very strange, that a philosopher as revolutionary and as, if I may say in this case, impersonal as Castoriadis talks talked about the most personal and personable lyrical poetry ever written by a woman as well, in this case, like Sappho. It's very interesting that in his analysis he talks about her poetry without ever reference to her sexuality in this case, but he actually refers constantly to her language, the polysemic variability of her language, as he says, which believes it's the beginning of the Western way of thinking through ambiguities, which is a very interesting aspect that of Sappho, and no Sapphic scholar has studied that as well. I think that his lectures have to do something with similar lectures given on ancient sexuality by Foucault during the early 1980s, and at the same time constitute an attempt to free the approach towards the Greeks from the narrow and somehow misleading constraints of French structuralism and post-structuralism. It is one of the desiderata of further analysis that he has worked to contextualize it within the parameters of the post-Sartrean structuralism. For example, in Socialisme Barbarie, Castoriadis seems to hate Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, and his attack on Sartre is constant until but that's why, just very late in his life. But later on, as you see, he became a sort of a kind of a critic of other French critics, other French philosophers like Althusser, and of course Foucault, and the so-called, as he called it, postmodernist e tutti quanti. I love the way that he says e tutti quanti, if he used this Italian expression. But at the same time, he was very close to classicists like Jean-Pierre Vernant, Pierre Vidal-Naquet, Marcel Detienne, Paul Vane, Nicole Auray, amongst others, and it's a very interesting approach, as you understand, you see his cultural anthropology within that context. We cannot understand Castoriadis' entire philosophical project, especially the last period, without this background. In a sense, Castoriadis had to tread through a very delicate and fragile balance between the structuralism of the dominant discourse and the most pronounced anti-structuralist thinking, with a project oriented towards human autonomy, as he said. Because where structuralists try to find the structures which made a way of thinking and acting possible, Castoriadis tried to point out the elements of a specific way of thinking that would not be explained by being reduced to their contextual particulars. Trying to find as he said, the rupture to what is not explicable by reference to what was happening in the society around them. For Castoriadis, thinking was a process, a constant process. Very interesting to see his article about democracy as a procedure and not as a regime, which is, I think, one of the most interesting articles, because you read the analysis of today, because today democracy has become a regime, it's not a process anymore, and we have to rethink about that as well. So it will be fully, as processes, structures were also submitted to conscious and sometimes subconscious interventions of individual autonomous activity. It would be foolish to think that there was only a passive relation, according to Castoriadis, with social structures, that the subject is interpellated, the concept of Althusser necessarily becomes a prisoner of a Platonic network of structural determinations. Castoriadis tried to disentangle, I'll try, the philosophy will end soon, don't worry. I'll become polemic after a while, and I'll start my polemic afterwards. But in the ancients like this, Castoriadis want to confront indirectly the dominant perceptions of the French intellectuals, amongst whom he always remained a marginal figure. And he always thought that they were actually trying to keep him at the corner, as he had to marginalize them, and he was complaining constantly about that. But he said, who pays attention to any attention to them? He didn't actually himself care, but he was always a sort of a kind of peripheral and somehow alien figure. But beyond this, Castoriadis wanted to establish his own, I believe, philosophical genealogy. Since his early years in Greece, when he studied under great and very demanding classicists, Castoriadis developed a deep interest for the Greeks. Even his immersion into Marxism did not quench his constant engagement with them, something which became more pronounced after his involvement with psychoanalysis. And at the moment you become involved with psychoanalysis, you understand that immediately the Oedipus complex will find you. So he will have to deal with this. Furthermore, after the late 70s, his center of interest seemed to have relocated from Moscow, Budapest, or Paris to ancient Athens, where he found, as he stressed on so many occasions, the germs of his own idea of human autonomy, articulated in practice at the most important confluence of historical, social, and intellectual events, which led to what he called Athenian democracy. Castoriadis' approach to the Greeks is fundamentally different, if you would, but I'm not going to elaborate on this, from the approach by Heidegger, for example, or Foucault. First of all, and must be stressed, Castoriadis had a deep knowledge of the unfolding continuity of Greek political and social life as a persistent dialogue and interaction between schools of thought, individuals, and ultimately political associations. When he talks about the ancient Greek philosophy, he stresses this dialogic element of Greek philosophy. The important thing he says is that not only Plato talked, but Plato responded to previous questions, who were responding to previous questions. Actually, he stresses as well the dialectical character of philosophical thinking in ancient Greece, that there was a school in Sicily, there was a school in Ionia, there was a school in Athens, there was a school in Macedonia, there was a school in Cyprus, and all of these actually were engaged in a very intense and somehow, as we remember, fierce and very, very, sometimes in that personal and ferocious dialogue, who is going to be the best philosopher in this case. To this mix, we have to add, of course, as you understand, the sophists. Most of you tend to underestimate the philosophical legacy of the sophists. Gorgias, for example, one of the most interesting Gorgias was the Derrida of the classical Greek period, as you understand. He deconstructed everything, and if you, for some of you, have the opportunity to read Plato's dialogue Gorgias, you will see that he's not the most scandalous thinker of the period, but he actually provoked the Greeks by saying the happiest man on the planet, he says, is not the pious or the good individual, but none other than the great king of Persia, because he was totally unhindered and without any restrictions by any other human being or any legislation except his mortality. So that's a very interesting question, as you understand, especially Gorgias. It's very interesting that George just left, Vasilakopoulos left. Plato would remain always the constant temptation. Peter Murphy told us that he's a Platonist, which, but I always thought that he remained the vein. Plato is the constant, temptation, the devil in his thinking, actually. As we call the ghost in the machine, he was the ghost in his own thinking as well. So I think Castoriadis' approach to the Greeks is different, as I said, to Heidegger and Foucault. And whereas Heidegger always insisted on the philosophical content of thought without reference or dependence on the philosopher or the moment of the conversation it emerged. Castoriadis localized a transtemporal meaning as an expression of dialogic patterns of signification, as he called it. Foucault also tried to find a change in the meaning of words as prior to a change of forms of life, as he said, around these words. For example, Foucault never understands that the word virtue, RAT in Greek, is used differently in Homer and differently in Christians. So in his history of sexuality, which was destroyed the sensitivities of so many generations after its publication, you have a dehistoricized perception of meaning, of the meaning of and the practice of sexuality in ancient Greece. You don't understand how he sees things a posteriori, the things that happened in the 4th century AD, in the Christian period. He projects them all towards the past, and it becomes really, as you understand, a huge confusion of the whole thing. So I think that it's a very important thing to discuss about Castoriadis. Castoriadis actually thought that Thucydides gave us an idea of, with his history, and I want to insist on that because we can discuss that, and we have already discussed that today, about what it means, what it was democracy. Democracy, according to him, was in Athenian democracy was the human confrontation with non-being, as he said. It's very important to see that, according to Castoriadis, the most important element of Greek thinking was as well the confrontation with meaninglessness, with non-being, as he said. The possibility that there's nothing, there's something, according to him, was, according to the ancient Greeks, was equally possible with the idea of non-being, something that does not really exist. And as you see, we always have a problem in translating that into English, because the ancient Greek is einai, the infinitive word to be, and non-being means non-einai, not being, which is a very interesting grammatical sort of kind of problem that we have in Greek language, as well as the word the being on, that's something which exists in process, in constant becoming. And what is the me on? Then something that it does not exist in constant becoming, or it does not exist. And the question is, how can we talk about something which does not exist? That's why the ancient Greeks didn't have the idea of the zero, of nothingness. So these are the ideas that we see in Castoriadis, especially in his readings of the ancient Greeks. Thucydides in particular has a very important, of a certain significance for him, because Thucydides in his second book of the Peloponnesian War gives us Pericles, the most important philosopher of the period, giving the famous funeral speech, which is essentially the only text that we have in defense of democracy in ancient Greece. As you know, it's very interesting to remember, and very peculiar, paradoxical, but despite the fact that the ancient Athenians are praised to this day for the invention of democracy, they were all against democracy. The only text that we have which supports democracy and gives a legitimation to democracy is the funeral speech by Pericles. Every other text that we have is against democracy. Even Aristotle in his Politics actually accepts democracy because the other two regimes, as you say, oligarchy and monarchy, are very excessive. You can't control it. This one is the best of the worst that we have in front of us. And it's very interesting to see that how the texts like Xenophon's, just the Old Oligarch, which is an amazing text against democracy and against Athenian multiculturalism and against Athenian the open society of Athens of the 4th century, is a text which has been silenced. You have to discover that one day, because it's called the Old Oligarch. It's a text written in 405 BC, before the fall of Athens to Sparta, the Peloponnesian War, which is a magnificent text in this case, because it says the Athenians accept everybody. They eat from food coming from all different countries. They dress like they are from Lebanon, he says, of Persia, in Egypt. And worst of all, he said, they change the language by incorporating words from other languages as well, which is the absolute corruption of the purity of the people who fought against the Persians in the 5th century. And now, what are we going to do with this multiculturalism? We have to destroy it. We have to abolish it completely. So it is very interesting that was the dominant perception that was back then, whereas Thucydides gives us the only perception that we had about democracy in that period. The Thucydides actually, there are many questions if Pericles actually said all these things, of course, and if in the end, it was all invention and nostalgic invention by Thucydides after the destruction of his country, in this case. Thucydides tried to find a way of, through the mouth of Pericles, to give us some principles of how this Athenian democracy worked. And of course, that Castoriadis is very important, because the most important event is not simply that you had the encounter, as he called it, the more important moment of the creative imaginary of the ancient Greeks, was not simply that they created democracy, but they were self-reflecting about democracy. They were actually trying to change constantly the democratic institutions constantly according to their needs every day, but with a responsibility, as he said, about towards other people as well. Don't forget that the Athenian Castoriadis mentioned that many times, and there was a law that whoever put forward a new legislation and failed had to be expelled from the country, from the city. So it was the act of legislating, of instituting new laws was a very important, sort of, if I may say, a responsible act of civil participation in ancient Athens. It was not simply that we have today, we think that come up with these ideas that there was an arbitrary and completely, in many occasions, as you understand, personal idiosyncratic perception of what is legal and what is not. It was an act of civil, according to Castoriadis, conciliation and reconciliation. So it's a very important aspect of how he sees the, I think, of his work, of how he sees, is that a utopia? This is a utopian dream. Was Castoriadis a utopian thinker, essentially? And he was trying to find, from what we know from the past, to reconstruct this lost paradise of political completeness and fecunding political imagination. Well, I think that this is another, it's a very important aspect of the whole thing. But for him, the ancient Athenian democracy was based on two things, which I think we'll finish with this, and I'll go to my polemical aspect of my text. First of all, he says that democracy is a tragic regime. That we don't have, wherever you read, when you see in historical terms, you remember that Athenian democracy coincides with the development of tragedy. At the moment democracy dies in Athens, tragedy dies as well. We don't have tragedies anymore. For him, it's a very important aspect of this the project of Athenian democracy, because it seems that according to him, tragedy was the most important social mechanism, not simply art, it was something beyond art, as you understand, for actually maintaining social cohesion and solidarity, according to him, or to Castoriadis. It's a very important aspect of his, if I may say, philosophy of history, that tragedy and democracy coincide. Now, there are many questions about this. We can discuss it if that's actually happened. And actually, I think that his idea that democracy ended in Athens with the end of the Peloponnesian War is rather inaccurate. Because Athens became under an oligarchy of the 30 tyrants, as they called them, for a period of time, but then democracy was reinstated. And don't forget that the greatest crime of democracy reinstated was the execution of Socrates as the person who essentially inspired the anti-democratic feelings in the country, in the city itself. So that's the one thing that we have to remember, that democracy is a tragic regime. The second thing, which is very important, and it's a very controversial, and we could be discussing about this for days, if you like, for hours, so we won't go to the dinner tonight. It's the idea that democracy is the regime of conscious self-limitation. The idea that citizens, as he's saying, in a democracy, live voluntarily and with their own decision, just conscious, they limit their needs and their, essentially, as you said, the demands from the state and the society. So they create a space, which we call the agora, where all people come together, they limit themselves, and then they interact as individuals. That's a very important aspect of the whole thing, because of his whole idea, because I believe that his main political theory, despite his Marxism, despite his modern belief in system that the post-Enlightenment philosophical systems go back to Aristotle's Politics, which says what is the most important aspect in a democracy is not the institution, if I may say, but the citizen. that actually supports this institution. And who is a citizen? That's a very important question in Aristotle's politics, and the answer is simple. The citizen is the individual who is capable to govern and being governed. So the idea for Castoriadis goes back to Aristotle, that you must be capable to govern and being governed in a democracy. And that's the most important aspect and characteristic of Athenian democracy. Now, do we have it today? I mean, I don't know if that's the case, but that's another story about this. So this is what he takes from this famous funeral speech by Pericles. As I said, did the Athenians practice these things?
To a certain extent.
To a certain extent. Is this a nostalgic reconstruction of a lost sort of a kind of democratic innocence? That's another story. We have to discuss that in this is another conference. But this actually understands this idea of democracy and capitalism as we discuss in modern society is a very important question for Castoriadis, especially if we see these lectures on the ancient Greeks within the context of the late 80s and early 90s. Don't forget that Castoriadis died in 1996, as we said, December 1996. And you have to see these ideas around that period of a very turbulent reality, and the young amongst us here do not remember what was happening in the late 80s, early 90s, but you remember it was the end of communism. A whole empire collapsed, and that was left behind, as you remember, this incredible mal du siècle, this melancholy that actually people experience to this day, because essentially for the first time we will have a political horizon without alternatives, and this is something that remained to this day. Castoriadis, as I said, raises these questions in that period exactly around between 1989 and 1991, when the first, the Berlin Wall started collapsed, and then the collapse of the Soviet Union as a state happened. In that period, he gave a very important interview in France called the Dilapidation of the West, which was translated for the first time and published in Thesis 11 in 1995, of course. That was one of the most very interesting, and I strongly recommend you can download it from the net here, the article by Castoriadis, this interview. The discussion is very interesting in this respect, the perspective we are talking about, because the title itself, the Dilapidation of the West, is rather sort of, if I may say, provocative, in the sense that it goes back to the famous book by Spengler, The Decline of the West, and all these ideas about the decline, the idea of something is declining and these kind of things. And I don't know if there's many of you who believe the romantics, who believe in the decline, the idea of decline. Do we decline, or we change, we transform, or something like that? But anyway, the idea of dilapidation is a very interesting metaphor, I would say, for this kind of things, of situation that was back in 1991. So I think, first of all, in these discussions, he tried to contextualize historical re-evaluation of ancient Athens within the realities of 1991. First of all, because of the fall of the communist societies, the gradual erosion, as he said already in 1991, of the American supremacy in a period that the dominant theory by Fukuyama was that the end of history was at hand and liberal democracy will prevail everywhere. And then finally, the third and most interesting, I would say, which I've never actually thought about this before, the rise and the intensification of religious and predominantly Islamic fundamentalism. Castoriadis stressed that the fall of communism did not actually lead to the absolute hegemony of the American imperium. On the contrary, events like the Gulf War, for some of you who remember the Gulf War, showed the limits, as he stressed, of the power of the United States. He then indicated that what he said, the frame of the social fabric, the ghettos, the population's unprecedented apathy and cynicism, corruption at all levels, the fantastic crisis in education. A majority of graduate students are now foreign-born, as he said. The challenge of English as a national language, the continued degradation of economic and productive apparatus, all this ultimately serves to undermine the United States' potential for world hegemony. So, I mean, he already questions the idea of the hegemony of the Americans already in 1991, which we believe that was the period that the Americans were the supremacy until the 10 years, as you remember, between 1991 and 2001, that they were the years of the, I don't know if you read Philip Roth's The Human Stain. It's about that belle epoque of the American supremacy within the United States, which coincided with the optimism of the Clinton years as well in the United States itself. So until we had George Bush and 2001, 11 September. Second, he stresses that between the Islamic world, which was raised in that, I'll finish, don't worry, Peter, and the West, there is a conflict between what exists, this conflict between we have the Islam and the West, as he says. It's not a conflict, it's not a matter of colonialism, it's not a matter of essentially what happened in the past, but it's conflict between religion and political society. Islam, he says, like almost all religions, claims to be a total institution. It refuses to grant a distinction between the religious and the political spheres. This current, he continues, culminates and builds its enthusiasm upon an anti-colonialist rhetoric that in the case of the Arab countries, this is the least, I could say, as he says himself, to be said hollow. He mentions incidents of the history of the Arabs and Islamic colonialism and expansionism. He asks, how come a small tribe from the center of Saudi Arabia found themselves in the middle of Europe, the center of Europe? That's colonialism and expansionism. And claims that Islam imposes a world of closed significations and therefore establishes and legitimizes a highly heteronomous society, and as he mentions, like every other religion. How does he explain the rise of such heteronomic cultural projects? He attributes it to a very important event, as he says, that happens within the West. And he says that all the rise of fundamentalism, the rise of religious fundamentalism in this case, and the rise of, as he said, of third worldism, all of this happened because, and that's a very brief but very important sentence, the West itself ceased to call itself truly into question. That the West itself stopped questioning its own ability to renew itself. It became, since we mentioned that before, an ossified system of practices, institutions, and significations. This is a very important aspect of his argument. Castoriadis says already since the 60s that the West, the Greco-Western tradition, as he calls it, in opposition, and it's very interesting, it's not today we think of the Western tradition as being against Islam or other global traditions, but in reality, the real enemy and the real opponent of the Greco-Western tradition is the Judeo-Christian tradition. And that's what it's indicating, because Castoriadis believed that you cannot religionize the West. This idea of the Greco-Western meant the opposite pole of the Greco-Western tradition was the Judeo-Christian tradition. And it's very interesting in Castoriadis' historionomy, there's no space for Judeo-Christian tradition at all. Is that possible? Something to be discussed afterwards, I believe. And he says in this case that the Greco-Western tradition is not a superior culture, which would be very erroneous, as he says, if we read his name, but an exceptional culture in the history of cultural interactions. Exception in the sense that it itself tried to actually destroy its own institutional structure in order to reinvent itself at many crucial moments in its history. He mentions the history of ancient Athens, he mentions Renaissance Italy, he mentions the French Revolution, the anarchist revolutions of the early 20th century, especially Spain and some other occasions, and of course, what he calls the autonomous movements that we see in Europe today. In reality, Castoriadis believes that the Western tradition itself is in itself an exception within the dominant anthropological structure of the human psyche, indeed an aberration, as he calls it, since it tries to take full responsibility of its construction, reinvention, and its own remaking, as he stresses in one of his response to the questions. As mentioned before, Castoriadis believed that the depoliticization and the privatization that dominated the West after the 60s led to the rise of the unpolitical and therefore of the heteronomic. It was the death of the politics, he said, that have created the situation that we have today. And he also claimed that most philosophical statements of the period simply try to accommodate radical thinking. He probably refers to Sartre or other, and probably Habermas as well. Radical thinking, try to accommodate radical thinking within the new political order of technoscience, which simply isolate individuals from social activity. It's not my topic here to actually refute or discuss the Castoriadis argument on the dilapidation of the West. But I think that we cannot understand what he tried to do with his statement if we don't revisit the Aristotelian idea of politics as the citizens of those who are capable of governing and being governed. Everything that happens in the West after the 60s, in particular, rendered that idea of a citizen implausible and probably infeasible. Despite small groups and marginal movements, the ecological, for example, or even of the sexual minorities for a period of time, seem to react and force changes to the political institution, the idea of the citizen itself has been marginalized and becomes more and more obsolete. Today, citizens are either followers or even more or worse, what we are today, we are voters. We are voting, actually. They sell their vote for privilege according to the interest they advocate, or even the short-term satisfaction of specific practices. According to Castoriadis, this peripheral, he says, cosmetic changes became in contemporary capitalism instrumental complements of the mechanism that maximize individual jouissance. Actually, this is a critique of Lacan, which are the sole substantive content of individualism as being pounded onto our heads these days, as he quips, characteristic. This gave rise also in philosophical terms to the critique of grand narratives of postmodernism. Castoriadis states that the ideas of deconstructionists to reduce the entire history of Greco-Western thought to the closure of metaphysics or to the ontotheologo-phallocentrism is to conjure away a host of infinitely fecund germs contained in its history. To identify philosophical thought with rationalist metaphysics is simply absurd, as he says. To disengage oneself from inherited thinking presupposes the conquest of a new point of view, which is what this tendency is incapable of producing, Castoriadis states conclusively, according to my perception. And Castoriadis states that the reduction of everything into competing narratives that we see today of equal value is extremely dangerous, as it ultimately stresses that the Aztec narrative of human sacrifices and the Hitlerite narrative are equally valid. So he criticizes here the relativism that we see today of postmodernism, and he uses the example of the Aztec narrative of sacrifices, of human sacrifices, and of course he says the Hitlerite narrative is equally valid in this case. Castoriadis ultimately argues that the dilapidation of the West is the product of the irrationalism of some such forms of philosophizing because of. All right, this goes off. Sorry about this. It seemed that I lost the pages. They fell down and I couldn't recreate it afterwards. Because according to him, all right. What happens when you have too many pages to read in this case?
Page numbers.
Page numbers. You have page numbers. 4. Yeah. All right. Yeah. I didn't think of that. Yeah. But obviously, page 4 is missing. Yeah. Right.
Creation.
Yeah. All right. Because I found it. Because of their refusal or inability to call the present-day situation into question. Castoriadis believes that the most important aspect that we can take from ancient Athens is not the sweetest dream of Western or European modernity, according to Paul Valéry, as I started my presentation, but on the contrary, a very, as he says, persistent and continuous questioning of your own personal and social foundations. How can we deal, he says, with these ideas of constant questioning? Is this the chaos that we referred to before? Can we give form to chaos? It's very interesting in that aspect that Castoriadis says that uses, and very interesting in that respect, the metaphor from Nietzsche, that if you look at chaos, the chaos look back to you. And he says, what you do in this case as I thought that Nietzsche would be his main enemy in this case, but obviously there's a very strong in Nietzsche elements. That's why Alex Kalinikos, accuses Castoriadis of voluntarism, that he believes that everything is a matter of individual will, volition to change things, and this is how things change. So Castoriadis tried that essentially in one way, by revisiting classical Greece, by revisiting what made ancient Greece, to give us a contemporary genealogy, not only of his ideas, but the questions that we have today. How we can revisit them, how we can re-articulate them. He was trying to respond to what we call the presentism that dominates today cultural studies and philosophical thinking, the cult of the eternal nows without continuity or pattern of development. Castoriadis revisited his beloved Athens not as a nostalgic paradise lost, but as a contemporary and continuously in front of us political project of renewal and for radical thinking. Thank you, and sorry for the